Thank you, Mr. Chair. And first of all, an excellent hearing. And you've assembled a panel here, bipartisan, that actually agree on one thing, that inflation is really bad for seniors, and they pay a really heavy price. Let me put up a chart. This describes how bad it is. Because we've devalued our currency, a dollar Americans held in 1998 is now only worth 51 cents. A dollar you held only 10 years ago in 2014, or 12 years ago, is now worth 74 cents. A dollar we held before the pandemic started was about 80 cents. Now, where there is disagreement is what causes this. I think I agree with three of our witnesses that it's because of massive government spending, deficit spending, printing the dollar, too many dollars chasing too few goods. But Mr. Lawson believes it's because of price gouging. Mr. Antoni, I think you pretty well nuked that in your testimony. Can you explain to Mr. Lawson why he's so wrong?
I'd be happy to, Senator. If we look at the data published by the Biden administration, so these aren't my figures, this is from the Biden administration, we see that prices paid by businesses for all the things they buy actually rose faster than the prices paid by consumers. So when you go to the grocery store and you grab the gallon of milk off the shelf, the grocer had to buy that gallon of milk first in order to put it on that shelf for you. And the rate of increase that grocer has been paying has actually been higher than what consumers have been paying. And that's why when we look at corporate profits, they're really not up after adjusting for inflation.
So businesses literally, in order to maintain their market share and be able to sell products, shielded consumers from, some of the inflation caused by massive government spending, correct?
Exactly, and that's why wholesale inflation peaked much higher than retail inflation or consumer inflation.
So Mr. Lawson, you say you travel all over, you're talking to seniors. Let me ask you a hypothetical question. If a family, let's say they have a major medical problem, and so one year they have to borrow $50,000 to take care of those medical bills, but then their family member gets well. Do families keep borrowing $50,000 and keep spending at that level even when they no longer have the illness?
Well, what I would hope is that Congress could come together and act so
Lawson,
that
just answer,
family would have to borrow.
What would a typical family do? They would lower their spending and stop borrowing, correct? So let me put up my next chart here. So American families wouldn't do what the federal government did here. In 2019, before the pandemic, we spent $4.4 trillion. Then we went on a massive bipartisan spending spree, $6.6 trillion in 2020. The pandemic eventually wound down. Okay, we were actually coming well out of it by the end of 2020. We certainly didn't need the Inflation Reduction Act, which sparked 40-year high inflation. Last 5 years, we've averaged $6.5 trillion. Last year, we spent 6.9. This year, we'll probably spend about $7 trillion. Mr. Antoni, is there any justification for maintaining this level of spending now that the pandemic is over?
Senator, I suppose that depends on how much waste, fraud, and abuse you're willing to tolerate.
I'm willing to tolerate none.
Well, in that case, then no, there is absolutely no justification for the figures on your chart there.
So I've given my colleagues a number of options to return to a pre-pandemic level spending. One of them was, if you go back to Bill Clinton's 1998 budget, where we actually had a surplus. And by the way, 40 Senate Republicans voted for that, and they voted for the appropriation bills. But if you go back to there and you increase that spending level for population growth and inflation, and you use this year's Biden's Social Security and Medicare, so you hold those programs harmless, that they are as they are, and interest according to President Biden's budget, we would have a spending level of $5.5 trillion. President Biden's projecting $5.5 trillion of revenue. That's how close we are to a balanced budget. Isn't that reasonable? Mr. Ferry.
I don't think I followed all your numbers, Senator. You're saying that the Clinton budget of 1998 would lead to tax revenue of...
No, what I'm saying is that back then it was $1.7 trillion because the dollar was worth more. But if you inflate that $1.7 trillion by population growth and inflation, but for Social Security, Medicare, and interest, you use this year's number, we'd be spending at $5.5 trillion. We'd basically have a balanced budget. If you do Clinton for 2014, do the same thing, you'd have about $6.2 trillion. Again, that would be a reasonable pre-pandemic level of spending to return to. And again, those are President Clinton's spending priorities. again, as I lay out these numbers, I'm one of the few people here that I'm an accountant. I actually use numbers. I look at history. My colleagues are actually shocked at that, how reasonable that spending level is. So again, I guess I'm just trying to get some comments. I mean, anybody want to challenge that that's not a reasonable spending level to return to? Now, again, we can spend on different things, but we shouldn't be spending at $7 trillion level, over 50% higher than the start of the pandemic when population is only growing 2%. That was, Senator Scott made that comparison. Spending was up something like 60% in one analysis. Population is only growing 2%. There's no justification for that, correct?
Yes, I absolutely agree with that. The federal government has broadened and widened its interest in various areas, producing very little in all these areas, when what it should be doing is focusing on those entitlements, including senior citizens. And this needs to be pared back dramatically and radically.
So, Mr. Chairman, just one quick question. In Mr. Antoni's testimony, you say that interest payments in December 2024 were $140 billion. Now, the interest expense I've been using in my analysis here was Biden's budget number at $965. You're saying that interest is going to be $1.2 trillion, but even the 140 comes out to about $1.6, $1.7 trillion. So I'm sure there's a timing difference in terms of interest payments. But is Biden that far off in terms of his 2025 interest expense of $965? Is it really going to be $1.2 trillion or more?
Well, Senator, I think what the Biden administration was probably referencing there was net interest, which is frankly kind of a made-up category. They take gross interest, the actual cost of servicing the debt, and then they subtract out a bunch of interest sources of income to the U.S. Treasury. And that's where we get this net interest figure. But again, it's not the actual cost of servicing the debt. For this calendar year, you're looking at about $1.2 trillion just for that one expense alone.
But if it flows through the budget, it is net interest. So the 965 is a reasonably accurate number then?
For net interest.
For net interest. Okay, that's what I want to know. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.